I'd like to introduce David Menninger from Ventana Research. He's going to talk about some very interesting benchmark information that he's collected over the past period of time. I'll let him walk through all of that information, his methodology, and I guess without further ado, David Menninger.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for sticking around. Last session on a Friday before your weekend. Appreciate that. This is kind of a tough spot. If you were here this morning for Jan's session, as I assume most of you were, that was pretty inspiring, pretty upbeat, and I'm not expecting that you get the same level of inspiration and upbeat, tempo from me. But I do have some useful information to share with you. But Jan did prompt me to go back and try and put a backstory together. So I thought I'd give you a little bit of a backstory. I didn't have any pictures from my youth or childhood. Any Ted Lasso fans in the audience? A few? Okay. Well, if you're a Ted Lasso fan, you might recognize this scene. I was in Richmond, England not too long ago, and I was able to go to the Crown and Anchor, which is officially the Prince's Head. And my colleague and I sat on the bench where Ted Lasso and Coach Beard sit and discuss the previous day's games. The backstory here is that for my son's wedding, I dressed up as Ted Lasso and gave my speech at the wedding as Ted Lasso. I won't bore you with the speech and repeat that for you, but Ted Lasso doesn't know about the game of English football. He's an American football coach who goes to England to coach an English football team. But he has information that's useful to them. So that's the analogy here. I've got some information that's useful to you. Hopefully it'll be very practical information that you can take back to your organizations and help you, perhaps inspire some of your colleagues or figure out, better ways to design and implement and deploy your systems. So I want to start with, a little bit of what's the situation out there in the market. So I was asked to come and speak on the state of analytics. And I think we get caught up as an industry, everybody thinking that we've got the shiny new car, right? Well, maybe the reality is a little more like this. It's not always the shiny new car. Realistically, it's somewhere in between. The reality looks something like this. Nice new cars, they're very functional. They have a lot of capabilities they didn't have many years ago. They're not necessarily the Ford GT, right? But they get the job done. They get done what we need them to get done. And they don't cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. I had to look up the cost of a Ford GT just to get an idea. I didn't realize they were $500,000. It's kind of ridiculous. So our agenda this afternoon, I want to give you a brief background to the research, just so you understand where it comes from, what it's all about. Give you some good news, give you some bad news, and discuss, how do we overcome some of the bad news? What are some of the best practices to overcome the bad news? And then we'll finish up with some recommendations, and I'll try to leave a few minutes for Q&A at the end. So we conduct primary market research. We go out and we survey thousands of organizations on the use of technology across a whole variety of different topics. Some of the studies that are relevant to what we're going to talk about today are listed on the screen here. So we study analytics and data and machine learning. We've done studies on data lakes and natural language processing. So the thing I want you to understand about the research is that we draw primarily from North America. So it's about, depending upon the study, 2/3 to 3/4 of the responses are from North America. Well, that's good for you, because most of you are probably from North America. It does have a fair representation of Western Europe and Asia Pacific as well, but clearly it's somewhat biased toward North America. Cuts across all industries, all company sizes, right? So we deliberately make sure that we get a good cross-section of types of companies and sizes of companies. So my point is that, you can rely on this as being representative, presumably, of your organization, unless you're, some, individual field that's quite distinct. I put my background in here. I'm not going to read it to you. You have this material to refer to later. I spent 30 years in and around the data and analytics market, mostly bringing products to market. And the last 7 years, I've been working with Ventana Research, studying this market and providing information to organizations that are using technology and vendors that are bringing products to market. So let's talk about what some of the trends are in the market. And as I was looking over these trends earlier, I was thinking about, these relate very closely to the vendors who are outside here sponsoring the event, right? We're moving from a relational model to relational plus other. So we've got, Neo4j out there with the graph database. We've got Vertica and Databricks and Snowflake all support object stores, right? So the world is expanding, and that's represented by the companies who are here. We're going from structured to unstructured data. Again, object stores are useful for capturing some of that unstructured information. From historical data to streaming data. I didn't notice a streaming vendor out here, but all of the vendors who deal with data are processing that data more quickly now so that we can try to react in the moment. From BI to AI, so Data IQ is out there, but we've also got the Clicks and the Alteryxes adding more augmented intelligence and AI capabilities into their products. We're moving from visualization, reports and dashboards, to conversational and natural language processing approaches. Again, the analytics vendors are adding those types of capabilities. On-premises to cloud. I'd be surprised if any of the vendors out there didn't run on the cloud, right? I mean, you've got companies like Snowflake that were born in the cloud and Databricks born in the cloud, but everybody's running in the cloud now. We're moving from parallel multi-threaded architectures to containerized and serverless architectures. I actually worked for Vertica 10 years ago, and at the time we were a parallel multi-threaded database, but that's not the state of the art anymore, right? We've got to be able to scale up and down in these cloud architectures. So containerized and serverless is much more scalable that way. Easier to try and buy, in part because they're available on the cloud, right? You don't have to install anything. The world of data governance and data management used to be about preventing people from accessing information. Now it's about enabling them to access that information. So if you look at Alation and Informatica's offerings, they have data catalogs to help people in the organization find the information that's available to them, not just prevent them from getting to information. And it used to be that all the data engineering and the pipelines were handcrafted. The only way you could build these things was write a bunch of code or manually create pipelines using some sort of data flow diagram. But now we're moving toward a DataOps and analytics ops approach with companies like, for instance, Monte Carlo, providing some data observability to be able to monitor those data pipelines and deal with the changes that might happen to them. And we've gone from a manual design process to AI and ML-assisted activities throughout the data and analytics world. So just joining data sources, doing your default presentations on visualizations, all types of AI and ML-assisted activities throughout the process. So these are some high-level trends. We're going to drill down on the research in these areas. First comment I'm going to make, I apologize for the font size. We have a standard style for developing charts, and it's really biased more toward print. You have a copy of these slides. You'll be able to access all the information. I'll call out the relevant parts as we go through the presentation. So the first one here is about data platforms. We talked about moving from relational to relational plus others. Relational and flat files are still the top bars in these charts. They're the ones that are used most often by most organizations. It doesn't necessarily mean they have the largest volume of data, but they are used most frequently. Show of hands, how many of you are using relational technologies? Right? Pretty much what's represented in the chart here. The thing to note, however, is object stores. Now, this is a point-in-time chart. You don't know what this looked like before, but I can tell you that object stores was not that far up on the list just a few years ago. So object stores are becoming very popular as a data platform for analytics. So that's one of the takeaways I would take from here. In terms of analytics, the traditional styles of analysis are still the most popular. It's still reports at the top, followed closely by dashboards. Those numbers are 87% and 83%. So nearly every organization is doing some sort of reporting and dashboarding. I'm not saying that's necessarily the most effective way to deliver information, but it is a very common way for organizations to deliver information. Now, you'll see on this list, these are the top 5. We're going to have a chart later with more, but you notice AI and ML don't even make the top of the list yet. So I'll put a chart up later that has AI and ML on it. But these are the most common ways that organizations are delivering information. So it's important for you to be able to do these things. I bet most of you are already. So the organizers, Scott and Kaid, asked me to include some anecdotes about how people are using this information, not just share the research. I don't want to hit you over the head with lots of all these charts of facts and figures, but that's what we do. We do the research. But to try and help you understand how that relates, this insurance company, it's a 100-year-old plus insurance company, was working with mainframe data, mainframe reports, obviously not the most flexible. There's probably some mainframe data still in use in your organizations. They then took information and consolidated it into a financial data warehouse. That helped. They were using traditional reports and dashboards. But the problem was the tool wasn't flexible enough for them to really be able to enable self-service. So the BI team became the bottleneck. Every customization to the reports and dashboards had to be done through this centralized function. And that was an issue. So they then went through the process of selecting another dashboarding and reporting tool. And now they're able to do these reports much more flexibly and have enabled more of the organization to modify and customize those reports. But sort of a corollary to that was that they were able to take this set of capabilities they had and publish information through their portal to their agents, right? Because in the insurance world, not everybody's captive. Some of them are agents. And by publishing this information through their portal, they were able to identify $50 million of cross-sell opportunity that they weren't able to surface previously. So, a direct benefit of modernizing their architecture, still delivering reports and dashboards, doing it in a more modern way that enabled them to share that information more broadly. So, I think everybody's probably aware that we're moving from long batch windows to very rapid responses. We want to be able to capture all the information that's being generated, capture it quickly, and use that information to do something. Right? The fact that it's being generated quickly doesn't do you a lot of good unless you act on it. So we've got IoT devices. We've got all the different systems in your organization generating machine data. You've got outside data, market data, social media information. You want to be able to capture all this information and use that information in your analyses. For instance, you want to prevent abandoned shopping carts. You want to be able to act in the moment. So if somebody's in a particular location, you want to be able to perhaps offer an ad that's relevant to that particular location. In the manufacturing world, the notion of predictive maintenance, being able to collect information about the equipment that's being used in the manufacturing process, recognizing that there might be an issue with that equipment, and knowing that shutting the equipment down, while it's going to cost you in terms of lost production, will cost you less than the damage that might happen if you let that machine run until failure. Right? So a whole variety of different ways that responding faster could be useful. Another trend we talked about is cloud. Now, cloud means a number of different things. Clearly, we're moving from on-premises to cloud. Another chart I could have put up here was that 3/4 of organizations are using some form of cloud-based technology in their data and analytics processes. But that doesn't mean that on-premises is going away, and that's why I wanted to put this chart up. More people prefer to deploy their analytics and data technologies on-premises than in the cloud still. Now, just slightly, 39% versus 34%. There's another 15% who are indifferent, right? So there's clearly a lot of cloud going on, but on-premises has not gone away. And so I want you to recognize that, and if you're not yet on the cloud, you certainly should be going that way. If you're entirely on the cloud, maybe you're a digitally native company, that's great. But if you're being told that everything has to go to the cloud, that may not be the right solution. I have a theory as to why this is the case. I don't have facts. We didn't ask these particular questions, but My theory is that a lot of the reason that on-premises still exists, there are certainly security concerns and for instance, HIPAA regulations and different certifications that are necessary before some industries can go to the cloud. But the other reason I think that some organizations haven't gone to the cloud yet is that they had on-premises technologies. They were working with vendors of those technologies who were moving their technology to the cloud, and the cloud is not yet entirely compatible or has functional parity yet with the on-premises versions. That's just a theory, but I think that may be one of the reasons why there's still a slight preference for on-premises. So we take these two trends of cloud and real-time, share a retail case study. So a large retailer with 1,400 different stores was looking to be more responsive with their customers, things like loyalty programs and so forth. They wanted to improve their supply chain. And so they adopted Apache Kafka to incorporate streaming information in conjunction with 600 billion rows of historical data. Right? So they've got their historical information, but they're able to combine real-time information with that and do machine learning models on the combination of those things so that they can be making, for instance, in-store recommendations to the shoppers who are using the online application, or sending out offers to get people into the stores. They've streamlined their supply chain as well in this process. And like I said, they're using the streaming part of this is implemented via the cloud. In terms of accessing information rather than preventing people to access information, data governance is interesting, and we've just recently finished this research. Surprised me that data governance is as well established as it is. More than 2/3 of organizations consider data governance to be very important. And almost 3/4, not quite, have implemented data governance policies in their organization. That's great. That's really good news, in my opinion. We need to govern the information that we're working with. But there's a lot of room for improvement still. Only 1/4 say that the data is well trusted, and only a similar portion are very confident in their data governance policies. So we ask, it's well trusted, trusted, and then further down the list. So trusted is still good, but well trusted is the top response that they could provide to us. So only 1/4, roughly, 28, 30% in these two cases, are saying that their data governance gets them to that top level. So there is room for improvement. One of the things that we found in the research that was interesting to me was you can account for a large part of that difference if you look at how long the data governance policies have been in place and how often the technologies are used. Those organizations that have had data governance in place longer and are using the data governance technologies regularly are experiencing much better results than those that are not. Again, these two bars here, the two comparisons are the well-trusted and the very confident numbers. The big long bar on the well-trusted is 58%, and the big long bar on very confident is 45%. And then the much smaller ones are 9% and 14%. So you can see if you put those together, this doesn't necessarily represent the entire sample. There could be other reasons why they were screened in or out of this particular crosstab. But if you put those together, we come out to pretty much that average that we were talking about a moment ago, right? So correlation, excuse me, correlation is not causation, as many of you probably know, but this is a pretty strong correlation. And whether it's the cause of these differences or not, or a best practice of organizations who are achieving these good results, there's still things that I think you want to incorporate into your organization. The other thing that we still see is a lot of spreadsheets in the data governance process. And the same was true around spreadsheets. They were much less likely to be using spreadsheets in their data governance processes when they had these policies in place or were using the tools regularly. So a healthcare example of the data governance information and technology. So it's a healthcare insurer in this case. And I'm going to refer to some notes here. I tried to memorize all these case studies, but we don't have a way to put notes on the screen here. And in this case, they had decades of information that they were trying to manage and incorporate into their analyses. And they had big problems with consistency in that information. Information coming from different systems, different parts of the organization, and so nobody trusted the information. And that obviously creates a big challenge. So what they did was they adopted data catalog technology from one of the vendors that's here today. And in the course of adopting that data catalog technology and lineage capabilities, they were able to build up the trust in the information. So now they're able to make decisions on this information and have much less risk that they're making the decision based on information that's inaccurate or not making the decision based on the information because it wasn't trusted. So these tools and migrations to these new technologies are good news. Some of the bad news, some of the challenges that still remain is that we haven't really reached the entire workforce. I'll share some data in a moment. We're not yet embracing all of the newer technologies, as I mentioned, for instance, with AI and machine learning earlier. Data preparation, data quality are still issues. They're challenges for organizations. The success of getting IT and line of business to work together is mixed, I would say. I think there's still a lot of, rather than say that there's challenges between the two organizations, I think we sometimes lose sight of the fact that the reason we invest in IT systems is to support the line of business. Now, I'm sure many of you, recognize that, but there's still many times where we get caught up in the fact that we're trying to implement a system, and we're all so focused on the system that we lose sight of the fact that we're implementing the system to support the business activities. So some of the data surprised me, has not changed a lot over the years, but in the majority of organizations, the majority of the workforce cannot access analytics. That's really surprising to me. We've talked about this for years. As I said, I've been in this industry for decades, and we've always said, 10, 20% of the organization is using analytics. Well, here are the facts, right? In 23% of the organizations, more than half of the organization is using analytics. So it is still a challenge. I would suggest that part of the reason that more people aren't using analytics is that we've been designing analytics for the analyst. And that is an appropriate persona to design for, but that's only one of the personas we should design for. And in my opinion, it's not the majority of the people who could benefit from analytics. Again, back to this notion that we're trying to support a business in its day-to-day activities. The notion of embedded analytics might be a better way to deliver this information than to expect everybody to become a trained analyst. I used to use this analogy of parachuting into China, right? You're parachuting into China, and you've got 1 billion people waving money in your face, and you say, no, tell me in English. Tell me in English. Learn a little Chinese, and you can work with them much more easily, right? Same thing with embedded analytics. Let's try and put it into the context of their jobs. And organizations recognize this. 73% of the organizations we polled said that it was important to embed analytics in their operational activities. And I went back and I looked, we asked the same question 7 years ago, almost identical numbers. It was 72% at that time, but even the split between very important and important was nearly identical. It was 31 and 31 last time, 31 and 41 last time around, 31 and 42 this time around. So organizations recognize this issue. I don't think we're yet delivering well enough on these capabilities. But I will say that the vendors are making a big investment in this area. All of the analytics vendors are investing heavily in embedded analytics now. And so it should be much easier for your organizations to take their technologies and embed them into applications and business processes. The other thing that was interesting, you hear all the hoopla around big data. We asked them to rate a variety of different technologies on their importance. And embedded analytics was second only to big data. AI was further down the list, natural language processing further down the list, big data top of the list, embedded analytics next. So these newer types of analytics, I said that, so if you put this list of 5 together with the previous list of 5, these are the top 10 types of analytics and how they ranked in terms of their usage. A couple things to take away from this chart. I know it's probably hard to read. The first one's natural language presentation. Second one's artificial intelligence and machine learning. Natural language search, conversational computing, and the one at the bottom is augmented and virtual reality. If you look at natural language processing, this is one of the technologies that I believe can help more of the organization access analytics. So embedded analytics is one good thing, but another is natural language. Just let me ask a question. It's still frustrating, right? I still can't get my home speaker to, a smart home speaker to play the right Spotify playlist half the time. So we're not there yet, but we're headed down that direction. And it's important for you to be aware of that and start to adopt some of these technologies. For instance, assisted search is probably reasonable today. You start typing, and some of the vendors now pop up lists of things that would complete the query that the person's trying to do. Right? That's going to be much more likely to work and be successful than just pure natural language, speak a query and get a result. But the other thing to note from here, both natural language processing and AI and machine learning are around a quarter, 29% and 25%, consider it very important or use it already. But if you add up the 3 bars of very important or use it currently, important or plan to use within 12 months, or somewhat important and plan to use eventually, if you add those 3 up, it gets us pretty much to the point where we saw reports and dashboards on the previous slide, close to 80-some-odd% in both these cases. So we're headed in that direction. We're going to get there. So the thing that you all need to incorporate into your activities, if you're not looking into these things today, you should be. Doesn't mean you have to be going whole hog, but you should be exploring and experimenting with them. And if you're already going down this path, you're on the right path. Don't give up. Right? We're headed in the right direction. We got to keep going this way. But data preparation is still a challenge. It's the biggest challenge. This question is about where do people spend their time? The first one says preparing data for analysis. Second one is reviewing data for quality issues. And it's not until the third one that you really get into any type of analysis, preparing reports for presentation and distribution. The next one is waiting for data. And the last one is trying to determine the root cause of the current situation. So these issues related to data take up more time than the actual analysis that people are trying to do. So we have to find ways to deal with that. And I'll go back to embedded analytics. Another way to deal with it, it also deals with this issue. Because if you're embedding the analytics into an application and business process, you know what data that they're working with. Maybe you've brought in other data sources to incorporate into those analyses, and you've dealt with that data preparation process for them. They don't have to spend all that time. The other thing about embedded analytics is that it helps deal with the data quality and data governance issues, because the data is coming from the application in which they're operating. So you don't have as many issues related to data quality when you're doing that. So recognize that data quality and data preparation are big issues still. So an example of how organizations are dealing with this. This particular organization is a manufacturer. They manufacture heating and cooling equipment. As you might imagine, not necessarily the most technologically forward company. They were having trouble with a variety of different issues, and what they decided to focus on first was the sales information. So they were doing, I don't think it was mainframe. It was not mainframe in this case, but they had static reports that they were using. And what they decided to do was to embed reporting capabilities into their CRM and sales applications. And they've been able to use that information to more flexibly access and produce the reports that they needed. They also suffered from the bottleneck issue, right? So changes to the reports were funneled through a common BI team, and that obviously typically creates a backlog. So by putting these tools into their applications, they were able to overcome that backlog issue, be able to build and customize the variations on the reports that they needed. They went from 20 users in the first year to over 400 users at the end of the year. And now they're up to over 900 users, and they've expanded beyond sales into the manufacturing and supply chain issues, into every part of the organization. So again, if you want to try to reach more than half of your workforce, I suggest that embedded analytics is one of the key ways to be able to do that. One of the other things that I think you ought to consider is incorporating external information. Many of you might be already, but this in and of itself has a good news, bad news side to it. When you go to incorporated external source of information, you get much better results, but you also have more sources to deal with. And if data preparation is an issue, right, you've got to have a way to do this and do it in a smart fashion. If you look at this chart here, it goes from 6 or more at the top down, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. The first 4, right, so 3 or more sources adds up to more than half. More than half of the organizations who participate in our research were using 3 or more external sources of information. That could be social media, that could be market data, could be demographics, could be environmental, weather information, right? Could be any variety of things that they might be working with. But when they did incorporate that information into their analyses, again, correlation and causation is a distinction, but they reported much better customer experience. They reported much higher rates of competitive advantage, much higher rates of saying that this information increased their sale, that their analytics increased their sales, and they reported that they were able to respond faster to opportunities and threats in the market. Again, doing a comparison of those organizations using external data versus those who reported 0, right, in the previous chart, that they weren't using any external information. Dramatic differences in the benefits that they reported from their analytics. Again, maybe a best practice as opposed to a causation, but it's something that you want to be doing if you're in this world of having access to external information. So the example I have of that scenario is a small business commercial lender. They take their applications online, and in the process of taking those applications online, they needed to try to speed up the process. You can imagine if they're doing this online, the maximum loan they do is $250,000. So you can imagine it's not a great business model if they have to spend days reviewing those applications manually. And so what they did was they took external information. They would take the application online, and through a variety of external sources, they could then validate the information that was submitted in the online application. And so by doing that, they were able to cut their processing time in half on the application process and automate many more parts of it to become much more efficient in their business. So just a simple example of how external data can be used in the process. So in the earlier trend slide, I talked about moving from manual processes to a DataOps approach. From my perspective, DataOps is really about anticipating change. So decades ago, we built pipelines that could run repeatedly, right? So sure, every night the job could run to bring the data into the data warehouse or whatever the systems were that we might be working with. DataOps, in my opinion, goes way beyond that. DataOps says we have a bunch of data pipelines, and we know that various parts of those data pipelines are going to change over time. So how do we anticipate those changes, and how do we react and respond to those changes so that when a change happens, it doesn't bring our systems down? When a change happens, it doesn't cause this big ripple effect that we have to go rewrite a whole bunch of stuff. Now, you can't do everything this way, but there are some things that you can anticipate. You can anticipate the columns in your source table changing and the columns in your target table changing, and some of those changes could be relatively simple. What do you think you want to do if a column gets added to your source table? Any guesses on what you might want to do in your target table? You probably want to add the column, right? Pretty simple. Now, granted, that's an overly simplistic example, but by incorporating metadata and working with vendors who understand this information, for instance, Monte Carlo, right? If you take this information and use the metadata associated with your data pipelines, you can anticipate the changes and automate some of those changes. So it may not even involve anybody's time, Perhaps maybe they just review it and approve the change as opposed to having to make a change. I also suggest that you extend that to analytic ops. So there are a bunch of vendors talking about data ops now. There are fewer vendors talking about analytic ops. And so that same thing is true in your analytic processes, right? You have dashboards and reports that incorporate information. A column goes away that's feeding into one of those analyses, right? You want to be able to deal with that in a relatively automated fashion. Try and minimize the effort that's required to deal with those changes. Or a column gets added. Again, you can do some of those things automatically. So I mentioned that metadata is the key. I think I've covered most of these topics. Oh, it does, like you read the Monte Carlo sign out there, deal with anomalies, right? You can identify when something changes. If something changes dramatically, that's probably something that you need to look into and react to and respond to. It also helps you identify and flag sensitive data, right? As a new column gets added to a table, does that column contain personally identifiable information? So lacking these things, someone has to manually go through and figure those things out. Try to automate as many of those processes as possible. And there's a whole bunch of information you can capture from the metadata about unusual usage that could help with the governance process, right? The amount of data that's being accessed from a particular location at a particular time, right? So maybe my ID is associated with, well, I happen to live in the Boston area. So my ID is associated with the Boston area, and I access large amounts of information, but I always do it between 8 a.m. and 6 p.m., right? I'm not typically working in the evenings or weekends. Then all of a sudden, my ID is being used in some foreign country to access gigabytes of information. Red flag. Right? These are all things that can be captured and incorporated into your data ops process. So, line of business and IT. I don't know if it's fair to say there's bad blood between IT and line of business. I think IT and line of business are typically trying to work together to solve problems in the organization. But I don't think we always succeed. And I think we have different perspectives. How many people in the organization would say they're from the IT side of the house? And how many would say they're from the line of business side of the house? A little fewer on the line of business side. So one of the things we see is that the IT and line of business folks have a different perspective on some of these analytic questions. So for instance, oh, my notes didn't get in here, great. For instance, the IT organization thinks it's much easier. I can't quote you the statistics. I had them written down, but they didn't make it into my phone. Line of business thinks it's much easier to work with big data than the line of business does. Line of business thinks that the data is higher quality than the line of business does. If you go down the line, IT generally has a rosier outlook on the situation than the line of business. Now, it could be that IT understands the technology better, and that's why they say, they're more confident in working with big data than the line of business is. But it could also be that IT doesn't understand the challenges that the line of business faces. So in this question, we looked at how well our organization, well, first, we looked at who is leading the analytic and data efforts, and then which of those combinations had the best results. So if you look at the chart here, again, I apologize for the font size, the largest pie wedge is cross-functional teams. So IT, line of business, several different groups represented in the cross-functional team. The next largest group is line of business analysts, and then the next largest one, the 21%, is a BI and data warehousing team. After that, it goes centralized IT, machine learning and AI professionals, line of business IT, and other line of business folks. So what's interesting to me is that the third wedge, so not the most common situation, but the third wedge, the 21%, are the people that are having the best results. So when there's a BI and data warehousing team, they get the best results in terms of the organization's satisfaction with their analytics and their confidence in their ability to work with the data. The next best result was the cross-functional team. So that top wedge is pretty good, right? They get good results, slightly behind the BI and data warehousing teams. And then, unfortunately, the line of business analysts don't do all that well in terms of leading the efforts. There are enough technology challenges that you do need to have IT involved. So, granted, you want to have a focus on how the business operates, but you also have to understand the technology. And so my recommendation, my opinion on what you do with this information is that you try to bring those teams together, right? I think a BI and data warehousing team sort of naturally does that, sort of spanning the technology and the use of the data, the understanding of the data, or cross-functional teams do well also. So let's try and get the organizations working across the aisle. So what are some of the recommendations? What are some things you should do with this information? First thing I'd say is think about the different personas. It's not just about analysts. Yes, there will always be ad hoc situations that require specially trained analysts. You're not going to be able to prepackage every analysis. You're not going to be able to embed all the analyses. Your business may be facing a fundamental change, and that's going to require ad hoc analysis. That's okay. Analysts are good. I'm not saying analysts are bad. What I'm saying is there's another group that you also have to pay attention to. You really do have to think about the line of business personnel and what's the best way to enable them. One of the things we saw in our research is that most of the people responding to the survey were building analyses for other people. So self-service has not really happened. And we need to figure out a way, in my opinion, we need to figure out a way to make that happen. And embedded analytics, I would come back to that as a key to trying to address these other personas. I do think AI and machine learning, broadly I've called it here augmented intelligence. Data science is still a very specialized skill. It requires a certain amount of training. The algorithms involved in AI and machine learning are complicated. They're not necessarily things that many of us learned unless we studied data science programs. But this notion of taking those things and putting them into the analytics tools is very useful. The notion of applying that to natural language processing, right? Let me ask questions in natural language or close to natural language, maybe typing them in a search bar with some assistance. Those are forms of augmented intelligence that can make analytics more effective and easier to use in an organization. We've got to tackle the issue of data preparation. That's still a big challenge in organizations. And we try to solve some of those problems by bringing things together, creating data lakes, data warehouses, and so forth. But that's not necessarily sufficient, right? Think about, again, coming back to embedded analytics, you know how the information is going to be used in certain types of analyses and certain applications. Put it together for them. Put it into those applications. Don't make them pop out to another tool to try and do these things. That's where the challenges arrive. And some of the vendors, some of the big app vendors are making big investments in this area. They're taking their application platforms and adding embedded analytics to them. A couple of them are clients of mine, and working with them, they are creating built-in, effectively, data warehouses within their application platforms and building analytics on those things. Whether or not you use those applications isn't the point. The point is they're recognizing that this is an important way to reach more of the market. And so, I think you should be considering that as well. How many people are already using cloud technology? Oh, smaller portion than I would have expected. Okay. But my rough estimate, maybe that was half of the people in the room. You're going to get there eventually. You're going to be doing stuff in the cloud. Doesn't mean you're going to be doing stuff exclusively in the cloud. And so my comment here is get involved in the cloud technology, but recognize that it's not going to be only cloud. One of the statistics I forgot to mention when we were on the cloud topic is that the majority of organizations are using a hybrid configuration, and the majority are using more than one cloud provider. So, sure, you get started with one, that's fine, but you probably are going to need to utilize more than one cloud provider for a couple of different reasons. Data sovereignty, if you're operating internationally, right, you may not be able to take data out of a certain location, and your cloud provider may not have a facility there. It may be because you're working with different application vendors. It may just be for safety and negotiating power, right? If you can move from one cloud provider to another, that gives you some negotiating power with your cloud providers. And the last comment is, let's try to bring IT and line of business together better than we have. Again, and I think it's a rare situation that there's real animosity between the two. I think most organizations want to overcome these challenges, but let's focus on solving the problems together as opposed to what are the differences between the organizations. The research shows that you get better results. So let's figure out how to work across the aisle and tackle some of those issues. So if I've done my job properly, I think I've left about 10 minutes for questions. And we do have some microphone runners if anybody has questions. While we're doing the Q&A, I'll put up some information where you can follow up. You can get more of our research or contact me or follow me on Twitter. But let's open it up for questions. Any questions from the floor? Yes. Here comes a microphone.
David Corliss, OnStar Insurance, part of GM Financial. You pointed out that your recommendation assessing a lot of this was if you want to expand analytics, an important channel is going to be self-service analytics. Where people need to be driving that, it has a lot more adoption. What are the barriers that you see that need to be overcome? Okay, if we go in that direction, what are our challenges and how do we overcome them? Thank you.
So I've said that, in my opinion, the main way to overcome self-service barriers is with embedded analytics, but another way is with natural language processing. I think the opportunities with embedded analytics are closer. They're available now. You can be embedding. All of the vendors who offer analytics capabilities have invested heavily in their APIs over the last, say, 3 to 5 years. So you can embed most of these technologies fairly granularly now, right? It used to be, oh yeah, you could do an iframe and bring the whole application into an iframe. Well, now you can take an individual object and put it into a portal or an application, right? As you get to more, cloud-based applications, it becomes easier too because you just have, simple reference to the object embedded into the screen that you're trying to incorporate it. But they've all made their APIs available. Most of them have gotten pretty granular with it. That would be my recommendation, is that you look at ways to, instead of asking people to leave the applications where they're doing their day-to-day job and go someplace else, bring that information to the place where they're doing their job. Now, there's some halfway houses, things like Slack integration, right, and other productivity tool integration. That's another way you can kind of get a halfway house. If your organization is heavily into collaboration tools, using those integrations is another way to get closer to where the workers are.
So, for example,
yeah.
So just as one example, let's suppose you had a purchasing department and they have a problem because people, thank you. Just suppose you got a case with the purchasing department and they have a problem. People want to write contracts now, but they're going to get paid for it later and prices might change in 3 months. So you could take that same purchasing, they're filling out the form, they're doing it online, pulling in a bunch of stuff, but you could add, for example, a forecasting algorithm based on currency exchange rate or whatever else. We think that, okay, it's going to cost $100 per part now, but when you paid for it, it's really going to be, we expect $112, put down that price, and they don't leave the application.
Correct, that's exactly.
That's the sort of thing you're talking about.
And you can go much further than that too. You could actually look at the behavior of the vendor, right? It could be by vendor. Maybe one vendor has a history of jacking up the prices much more rapidly than another vendor. Or maybe a particular type of part has a greater fluctuation in its pricing. So yes, all of that could be used right in the application to make a recommendation on how to execute that purchase order. Other questions? Yes.
You introduced a term I haven't heard a whole lot. Could you talk a little bit more about analytics ops?
Oh, sure. Yeah, analytics ops is not widely talked about yet. Data ops is becoming fairly, I'll say, fairly widely used. Still early in its technology development, but not many organizations are extending that to analytic ops. I actually think, well, I'll call out one of the vendors here, Alteryx. So Alteryx for a while used a term, I think it was analytics process automation, APA, right? In my opinion, that's effectively analytic ops. It's automating the process of the various steps in the pipeline. And the thing that we need to do more of, though, is recognizing that things are going to change and anticipating that change and reacting to that change automatically. But not a lot of vendors are using the term analytics ops yet, and not a lot of vendors are doing much in a technology platform to deal with it. There is one vendor, they're not here today, I'm not going to mention them, but there is one vendor using that term and specifically talking about analytic ops, but it's still very early in the process. All I'm suggesting is information doesn't stop at data processes. Information encompasses data and analytics processes, and if you only do data ops, you're only dealing with part of the process. Is that helpful?
That's great.
Okay. Any other questions? Nope? All right. Scott, are you going to offer some closing comments?
All right, well, once again, as I mentioned this morning, thanks for everybody spending their gas money coming out to see us today. We are going to close with some raffles that we always do every year. And again, I want to thank all of our sponsors. I want to thank Jan from this morning and the keynote presentation. I want to thank David from the capstone presentation today. And so without further ado, if we want to kind of get into a reminder of, use your phone app to provide feedback on any of the presentations today. You can still do it, I believe, after the event as well. So Aaron's nodding, which is great. Please do provide any feedback around the actual event. We did take basically a 2-year break due to the pandemic, so maybe we did some things this time that are better, maybe we did some things this time that maybe aren't so good, but please do provide feedback. So the vendors who are going to be providing their gifts from a raffle, if we could kind of rustle them together. I want to remind everybody that anybody who is still here who visited all 12 booths, we're going to be providing a gift card. And Aaron, if you can help me tell everybody how they're going to get that. Okay, cool.
All right, we have a Sonos here. Pedro Tan.
Hi, I'm Ramsey from Snowflake. Thank you guys for coming today. Michael Boggs. Hey! All right.
We have some gift cards for folks that were the most engaged on our app in the leaderboard. It was a clean sweep from Independent Bank. So for first place is the most active with the most achievements was Ismael Ramon Marquez for a $100 gift card. Awesome, congratulations. Second and third place get a $50. So second place was Taylor Jacobson, and third place was Patrick Elpers.
All right, so for the Amazon gift card, Aaron told me that we're going to be sending those out via email. So everybody's going to get that in their email. So thanks for participating in that, visiting our sponsors. Want to wish everybody a wonderful and fantastic summer. The event is at a wrap here, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.